you, Amanda. And I have to say that Drew's story was wonderful, and I was having flashbacks to the days when I was a substitute teacher, and I had little children just like Drew. As Amanda said, I'm a historian, and my research has been about the important role that the automobile played in the lives of African Americans living in Jim Crow America. And while there have been many books written about the automobile and white America, the role of African Americans and the automobile has not been written about before. And it really changed African American life. As a historian, and a 20th century historian, I like to gather stories. And tonight I'm going to tell two stories that are part of the research for my book. So if they didn't have cars, Black people had to use public transportation. They traveled by train, they traveled by bus or trolley. And on all of these public conveyances, they faced not only segregation, which told them that they were inferior, but they also faced public humiliation. So for example, they might pay their bus fare at the front door and be forced to go to the back door to enter the bus to take a seat, only to have the bus driver pull away as they went to the back door. So my first story is a case in point about segregation on public transportation. A dear friend of mine, her name is Vernell Allen, and she's in her 90s now, and she and her friend were traveling by train to Norfolk, Virginia, to visit her family in 1948. And Vernell was really hungry, and she wanted to eat a big breakfast. They were on the train, and they were going to the dining car. And she could already taste the bacon and the eggs and the toast and the ham. That she told me that's what she wanted, a huge breakfast. And when they got to the dining room, they were upset about the separate facilities that they found. There was a dining room for whites, and there was a dining room for colored. But they were too hungry to skip the meal, so they decided to go to the colored dining room. So they sat down and they waited for the waiter to come and serve them. And they waited and they waited. And after about 25 minutes, because he had to wait on the white people first in the white dining room, he came to their table and he looked around to see who might overhear the conversation. And then he whispered, "You don't want that. You don't want this meal. I'll bring you some orange juice and some coffee. Everything else, if I serve it to you, it's food that's been scraped off the white people's plates from the other dining room." Now, understanding that the women would be upset by this revelation and that he was really going to be sending them back to their seats hungry, the waiter sweetened the message that accompanied this very small act of defiance and act of kindness. He said, "To make the day better for you, I'm going to put some vodka in your orange juice." So you can see that African Americans were treated extremely badly on public transportation, but they liked to drive cars, and cars provided freedom and they provided privacy away from this kind of humiliation. And African Americans bought cars in really large numbers, and they often bought really big cars. They bought large Buicks and Oldsmobiles. And a big car was necessary if you were a Black driver because you had to carry everything with you. You had to carry food because you couldn't stop at a restaurant. You had to carry blankets and pillows because you couldn't stop at a hotel. You had to carry, you might carry gasoline just in case you couldn't find a gasoline station that would serve you. So you really needed a big car. And the other thing about a big car was it could be fast to get away if you needed to get away from an angry mob, and it was harder to turn over. Black neighborhoods were often redlined, so Black families were prevented by the collusion of banks and realtors and the federal government from purchasing houses. So cars were their next large purchase, and they could afford to buy a larger, more expensive car. But there were also lots of dangers if you made a wrong turn and you found yourself in the wrong town or in the wrong neighborhood. And that's the subject of my second story. This is a story about the Holloway family. Young Joseph Holloway was 9 years old, and in 1961, he and his aunt and uncle left their home in Los Angeles, California, to visit his dying grandmother in Louisiana. And of course, to get to Louisiana, they had to drive through Texas. Now, Uncle Gus Holloway and his wife could not read, and they depended on 9-year-old Joseph to read the road signs. They wanted to stay on the highway. African Americans, when they were traveling, generally tried to stay on the major highways. They didn't want to veer off and go into little towns, because you never knew how you would be received in a little town. But they made a wrong turn. They read the sign. Joseph read the sign incorrectly. So somewhere near Waco, Texas, just as the sun was setting, they drove slowly down the main street, and they saw that there was a crowd gathered. And so they were concerned, and they were kind of peering out the windows, looking to see what was going on. And then they realized that they had stumbled into the middle of a lynching. And the angry crowd was just about to light the Black victim on fire. Well, they were driving slowly to see what was going on, and the lynchers spotted the Holloway's huge Chrysler, and they ran for their cars and for their trucks, anxious to add these Negroes to the pyre. Let's get them, they said. They were really, you could imagine, the crowd was really angry, and the Holloways were terrified. Uncle Gus turned the car around as fast as he could. And that big car, you could imagine, making a K-turn was near impossible. And he hit the accelerator, racing out of town with the lynch mob in hot pursuit. So all night, they were avoiding the lynch mob. They hid in country lanes. They hid in tall grass. They crept out of town with their headlights off, trembling with fear for hours. And they watched the headlights of the trucks and the cars that were looking for them. But they were fortunate enough to elude the rioters. When they got back to LA, what was the first thing they did? They enrolled in literacy classes to learn to read. So most automobile trips for African Americans were uneventful and not the type of terrifying encounters that the Holloways faced. But although the automobile gave Black drivers freedom from Jim Crow transportation, they still had to worry about violence, whether from angry mobs or law enforcement, each time they ventured out on the road. And for me, these stories really helped me to understand the incredible courage of my parents and of other African Americans who chose to go out on the highways, and also their perseverance in the hopes that things would someday in this country get better. Thank you very much.